I was leaving the lab at Wits the one afternoon, and a young man stopped me, and I could see he was looking to kind of ask me an impressive question. He says, "Why do you think Peco will be successful when there are so many competitors out there?" And that's a good question, right? And I said, "I'll tell you why I think Peco will be successful. Because we don't see the competitors as those that are selling similar products. The real enemy out there is not our competitors. The real enemy out there is poverty, which is destroying the lives of people. And there are 600 million people in Africa that have no access to power. To be honest, there aren't enough suppliers. If Peco can challenge others to come into this market and offer a better product at a more competitive price, which means it puts it in the hands of more people, then that's success."
Dorian,
Nathan, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Being an entrepreneur has its challenges. So I usually begin my podcast by asking my guest if they could rate their overall well-being on a scale of 1 to 10 and give me a reason why.
Nathan, you dive straight into the tough questions, don't you? Interesting. You and I were talking just before this podcast. And so let me say, firstly, I think I'm a 9, but I'm feeling quite challenged, to be honest. But that's because I think that challenge is a normal part of what gets the best out of us. So I don't think that's a bad thing. So I think I'm a 9, but at the same time, I'm really challenged at the moment to try and find some breakthroughs and some solutions, particularly in my business, Peco Power.
That's perfect. And we're going to dive into all those challenges, but I have to say that I'm very pleased to hear that you're a 9. I've had some people that say that they're a 6. So hopefully after my podcast, that goes to a 9 or 10. I want to start by going through where you grew up, because you did grow up in Cape Town and you schooled here.
Yes.
So tell me what it was like growing up in Cape Town. Not to give away your age, but
55.
You're 55. So growing up in Cape Town in the 80s,
yes,
schooling here, what was that like?
Grew up in the northern suburbs. Came from a family where broken home, so single mother, pretty much raised us as a single mom. Not for all of that time, but for a large part of that time. Not from a particularly wealthy background, so we had to really trust to find solutions to be able to afford to go to university. But I guess growing up in the Western Cape at that time, it was a challenging environment politically. Certainly UCT was a hot political bed at the time. And I remember on more than one occasion kind of having to dodge tear gas canisters and duck into corridors to get away from, the authorities that had a different view on human rights back then. But on the whole, the Western Cape was a great place to grow up. And it certainly was quite defining in who I am as a person today, and the belief system, and I guess what I call the worldview that we operate from. So it was an incredibly, I guess, productive and defining time for me as a young person.
Before we get into your worldview, which I'd like to ask you about, tell me about what shaped it. Was it seeing brutality against other human beings? Was it lessons that you were taught? What shaped that worldview?
Nathan, looking back in hindsight, you'd always I think what really shaped it was only many, many years after the event. Growing up in the northern suburbs, back then run by the National Party, there was a particular narrative around the swart gevaar, as that was called back then, the black danger. It was linked to a socialist agenda. And you realize just how that political system indoctrinated us where we lived in fear of anything that challenged the status quo that we were growing up in. And when I got to UCT and I realized, and I started seeing a different narrative playing out, and many, many years later, realizing just how inconsistent that narrative was with a Christian worldview or a Christian mindset, which is based on love. That, to be honest, was what defined and made me realize that things are not always as they seem. And if I could do it over and over again, there are probably a number of things that I would have done differently. But I'm grateful that I was able to kind of experience these things young enough, while it was still able to formulate and frame my worldview and kind of my purpose in what I wanted to do in life.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. When you got to UCT, was there people of color? Were you exposed to people of color for the first time?
So, of course, growing up in the 80s, schools were still pretty much single. And yes, at UCT, I was exposed to people of color for the first time, but it wasn't like that was the challenge for me. Growing up in a Christian home, there was an understanding of just God's love for people of all races. Yet, there was a paradigm that different races had different skills and different talents and different abilities. And of course, that would be reinforced because the education system in the white areas would be completely different from the education system in the black areas. And so just people that you generally come into contact with, the level of conversation might be different in one area over another. But as I developed and as I discovered and as I built more friendships with people, I realized that it's not just the level of your education, but it was the depth of what people were believing and feeling and processing in their hearts that defined who they were, as much as it defined the process in which they were brought up. And I guess that was an eye-opening challenge for me.
Yeah, definitely. I hear that you speak about once you actually experience these people of different backgrounds, of different races, you actually had empathy. That's what I'm hearing. And speaking to your peers and reading things about you, one thing that's a common thread is your heart for people. And do you think that that was also shaped when you're growing up, or did that have to develop over time to actually have that sense of empathy towards other people?
So Nathan, this is something that I think about quite deeply and quite often, because the people that I grew up with when I was young weren't bad people, but they had a mindset that was incorrect. And so they operated in love and empathy, but almost with a false paradigm that certain people could not be engaged beyond a certain level. And so they operated in what they understood to be love and empathy. And I guess the change for me wasn't that I started operating in love and empathy. The change for me was that so many of the paradigms that had been doctrinated into me, I realized were just false, and I'll give you an example of that. A paradigm that certain races just are superior intellectually is false, right? And yet, if you believe that, love looks a certain way within that paradigm, empathy looks a certain way, but actually it's cloaked in patriarchy and sexism and racism. And I think that was the paradigm that shifted in my heart, which I'm so grateful for. Brought on by, let me just say, by a kingdom Christian understanding and worldview, which I believe is a true Christian and kingdom understanding when I study the Word of God. Even though the church is blamed for a lot of the stuff, and to be honest, people that try hard, I don't actually think their intentions are bad, but when their worldview is wrong, they end up exercising empathy in a way that they think is empathy, but is actually influenced significantly by racism, sexism, or patriarchy.
So if I'm understanding you correct, you come from a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
Could you just dive a bit deeper into that?
So I'm more convinced now than ever before that every single one of us operate from a particular worldview or belief system, right? The way we brought up, what we are taught to value, what we are taught to empathize with. All of that comes from the way, from our childhood, from our upbringing. It comes from significant influences in our lives. And that then frames what I then call this worldview. And that worldview influences every aspect of our life because it's the way we make decisions. Let me give you an example. If we just use two predominant worldviews, capitalism and socialism, so the socialist worldview will say, well, what's wrong with this world is that wealth is centralized in the hands of a few, and those few are greedy. And so as a result, there's poverty. And the way you solve that poverty is you remove the wealth from the few, from the greedy few, and you distribute it as equally as possible across the masses, because that's how you alleviate poverty. And so individual asset ownership is not the solution, but state asset ownership, because who better than the state to administer the wealth on behalf of all the people? So that's a socialist worldview. Capitalist worldview, on the other hand, says, no, what's wrong with this world is, yes, poverty, but the way you alleviate poverty is you don't take it away from the people that manage and create wealth most effectively. In fact, you make it easier for them. Remove the bureaucracy, remove the barriers, make it more competitive, because as they are able to become more productive with their wealth, they create more jobs, and that trickles down onto the poor, and that's how you alleviate poverty. But of course, neither of those have given us the solution to completely alleviate poverty in the world. And you would have proponents of one or the other worldview, one or the other belief system, that will argue why theirs is better than the other. As a believer, as a Christian, I embrace what I call a kingdom worldview. And other than a socialist worldview which says the state owns everything, or a capitalist worldview which says individuals own everything, a kingdom worldview says that God owns it all. But he hands over stewardship of those assets to individuals, to families, and sometimes to institutions. And he says, work these things, prosper these assets, create wealth with them, but don't then fall into the mistake of thinking that they're yours once they're created. I've given you the ability to create this wealth so that you can use it to build God's kingdom, to build my kingdom. And that means that you look for ways to distribute that wealth and to create that wealth in the lives of all of those within your community. And so, unlike socialism or capitalism, this puts a personal responsibility on us to say, God, what do you want us to do with those assets that you've entrusted to us as individuals and as families and as institutions?
And is this belief system based on the Bible? Would you say that that's how you operate?
I believe it absolutely is consistent from Genesis right through to Revelations. And I see this throughout the Word of God, how the Word of God tells us that all of the wealth belongs to Him. And the Word of God is consistent through when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden. He gave them a mandate. He said, tend this garden, work this garden, make it prosper, let it bring forth fruit. Because he gave them a job. The first thing God gave mankind was a job, to tend and to work it. And so that talks of stewardship. And so I see that consistently throughout the Word of God. When the nation of Israel in biblical times took on this responsibility, there were no poor anywhere within the nation of Israel, because there were specific mandates that God gave the people of Israel. And that reached its zenith, I guess, under King Solomon, when the people came from all over the world to see what God was doing in the nation of Israel. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. I think that's what happens whenever superpower. I think it's a warning to any superpower at any time in the world, is that superpowers come and superpowers go, and we shouldn't be surprised when the next one falls and another one takes its place. because there is some application of good stewarding principles that result in prosperity.
Speaking of that power, do you think that it stopped because individuals embraced that power in a way in which that was selfish as opposed to selfless?
Spot on. I'll give you an example. There were some principles that God put in place. There's this principle of Jubilee, right? Every 50 years. So let's roll back the clock. Initially, when God divided up the land of Israel, it went to tribes, it went to clans, it went to families. Every family had their own assets, their ability to create wealth. But when people didn't steward that wealth properly, they ended up losing their wealth creation mechanism, and eventually some of them went into slavery. And slavery was there so that they wouldn't die, so they would effectively become servants of someone else who had acquired their property, but so that they would survive. But here was the principle. Every 50 years, that land would return back to the original owners, so that one generation's mess up wouldn't affect the next generation's ability to create and prosper. And so that was a mechanism. Now, we don't see too many, in fact, we don't see any times where that was actually, where that Jubilee principle was enforced. But I've no doubt that at the time of Solomon, when there was high prosperity, there were no poor in the nation of Israel. But as that nation went into decline, there are plenty of examples of how the rich were exploiting the poor. And I believe that is one of the key factors in a nation. When you start seeing that happening, a nation's going into decline.
And for those individuals that don't have a kingdom worldview, as you describe it, do you think that being able to coexist in a world where values are aligned but beliefs are different, is that possible?
You see, so what I do see in the Word of God is there's some principles that create prosperity and wealth. So ultimately, what we see that these principles tend to work. Gravity will work. You step off, a table, you're going to go down, right? Gravity works. These principles work, whether I believe in them or not, if I apply them. However, for these things to be sustainable, you need a heart that thinks beyond me and my needs. And ultimately, that greed is only something that I believe God can deal with in our hearts. Now, principles will work. You work hard, you're probably going to have more to eat than someone who's slothful, who doesn't work hard, right? So that principle works. Ultimately, though, for a nation to be sustainably prosperous, you need a nation that says, listen, I can only prosper in the long term if we all prosper in the long term. And generally, anything that doesn't get us all to prosper has a timestamp on my prosperity. And that's where I think a lot of nations will then eventually go into decline. Communities will go into a decline. And you're going to end up with a scenario where the wealth is centralized in the hands of a few that have no intention or incentive to share that.
This episode is proudly sponsored by Peco Power. Peco Power has developed a solar-powered portable power station that is able to keep your household devices and appliances connected during load shedding. The power brick is able to produce a continuous rated power output of 200 watts, but what makes it unique is that the system is robust, has a long lifespan of over 7 years, and it's expandable so that you're able to power more of your devices for a longer period of time. Contact the Peco Power team for more information. Thank you for that. So when you were starting Umbono Capital, was it based on this actual principle of trying to... Actually, I just want to hear, what was your intention behind starting Umbono Capital?
So my partners and I were actually in other parts of the world. And but in the other parts of the world, we realized that we just had such a sense that God wanted us to come back and do something significant in South Africa. And so we started Umbono Capital, which builds businesses in the natural resource space. But that was exactly why we wanted to do it. We said, God, how do we build a kingdom business? And what is a kingdom business? And what does that look like? And we said, well, firstly, I think the ownership needs to be right. And so we created these broad-based empowerment trusts way back in 1998. And what's that, 25 years ago? And these empowerment trusts focus on education. I think we've put, don't quote me, somewhere between 50 and 75 kids through high school, some of the best private schools and some of the best public schools in South Africa. The approach we decided to take was, we said, there are some Madibas, there are some Mandelas out there that are stuck in schools that are not going to bring out their full potential. Can we go and find some of them and give them an opportunity to go to some of the best schools in South Africa, an opportunity to really flourish and come to the surface? And so what we do is we find kids from grade 8 to grade 10, and we then put them through their entire high school career and then into first year university. And in that process, we link them up with mentors. So those that come in grade 8 will be a 5-year process, 5 to 6 year process. And that mentorship program we'll liaise with them frequently during the year. How are you doing? What's happening in your life? And just touch base with them. We'll bring them on a leadership camp once a year. And we will all come together from all over the country, and we'll spend a weekend together where we'll just kind of try and impart leadership and kingdom principles into young people's lives.
Is this your leadership in transformation program?
It is. It's called the IEDT, the Intlakanipo Education and Development Trust, and the Leadership in Transformation program has sprung out of that. So that focuses mainly on university students, but the IEDT focuses on learners from grade 8 to grade 12. But yes, they're very, very closely linked, and they operate together. And Nathan, the amazing thing is that some of our earliest scholarship holders are now through the program, and they're mentors within that same program. And so just being able to kind of pass that on, many of them, and this I'm very, very excited about, have themselves now go and raised capital and raised money and donations to put into someone else's life so that they can reproduce and replicate what happened in their life through grade 8 to grade 12.
Amazing. And Umbono Capital has 4 parts?
It may have. Being an entrepreneur, you kind of constantly well, where's this next opportunity? But look, the overall theme, natural resources. We build businesses in natural resources. That started out primarily in the mineral resource space, early stage exploration projects, moved into energy, oil and gas, and most recently into renewables, and now ultimately into Peco Power.
You were part of a executive team, if I'm correct, on some of these companies that Umbono Capital acquired or was under the umbrella. Could you walk us through some of those experiences?
Right. So because we develop businesses in natural resources, and we're not a traditional VC company. We did things a little differently. We were very fortunate. In 2004, when mineral rights law was changing in South Africa, we managed to acquire some very, very exciting early stage exploration projects. And it was the start of the super cycle. We like to look back and think, my gosh, we were smart. But to be honest...
What's the super cycle?
Well, there was a commodity super cycle from 2004 to 2008, where all of a sudden commodity prices just started going up almost, it was exponential growth. And anybody who had anything that could possibly have a mineral was raising money on the various markets, Canadian Stock Exchange, the TSX, anywhere you could think of. There was a rush for mineral assets. 2008, you're too young to know this, but in 2008 there was a financial crisis. Lehman Brothers went out of business, one of the biggest banks in the world, and that just sent the world into a bit of a tailspin. To be honest, that early stage exploration never recovered. So we were on that, and we managed to build significant wealth within Umbono. On paper was worth billions of dollars, right? And then almost within 2 or 3 months, those billions of dollars were almost wiped out completely. But we had managed to monetize some of those assets. And that then made us, helped us then diversify into energy assets like oil and gas, but also more recently into renewable assets like Peco Power.
Okay, and before we get into Peco Power, I want to understand your acquisition process. What goes into that? How do you actually identify viable markets? And could you maybe give us some tips on that process?
It's so we're not a typical traditional VC, and so the ideal acquisition target for us would be one in which you needed to not just bring capital, because you can get that almost anywhere, but bring the skills to actually turn that asset around as well. So we tended to look for assets that lacked skills, technical skills, and needed capital to get them going, and that then led us to, say, a farmer that had a mineral right that had no idea how to develop that mineral right, or a company that was focused on developing its mine but had these other mineral rights around it which it wasn't focusing on. And so we would effectively earn in what's called earn into those. You'd spend money by earning into it and then earn a stake in it. We did best when we could take majority stakes in things. We realized early on that for us, we were very bad passive partners. We weren't the money and keep quiet and just send us a check every now and then. We were pretty bad at that, mainly because I guess we struggled to find partners that had the same worldview as us. And what we were focused on was developing assets in such a way that they would benefit the communities in which those assets would be developed. I'll give you an example. One of the reasons we got into mineral resources was because we were gripped by something in South Africa that was a throwback from the apartheid era called migrant labor. Migrant labor did was it took the men from their homes in the Eastern Cape and in KZN and shipped just the men up to the reef, housed them in hostels so they could mine the gold and the platinum. And then once a year or twice a year maybe they would, if they were lucky, they would get home to see their families. What would happen is these guys would be up here, away from their families. They would probably end up having two families, one down in the west, in the KZN, and another one up in Gauteng. What happens? You have a generation of young people growing up in a single parent home, growing up without fathers. How do you think, what does a family unit look like in a scenario like that? How do you even think about creating a strong nation if you don't have strong families? So when we developed our platinum assets, we said, we're not building them the way their mines were built historically. We're going to build not hostels, but we're going to build communities. We're going to build communities where there are going to be 3 and 4 bedroom homes, where men and women will come, but they're going to bring their families with them. And we're going to build communities where there are going to be churches and where there are going to be retail shopping centers. And we're going to build a community where there is going to be a thriving hub around that community, around the mine. And so that's what we were able to do in the earlier days, before it became legislated, before it became part of your mining and labor plans. We said, this is what we want to do. We want to build these differently. And so we were almost driven by a purpose, way beyond just a profit purpose, a purpose to say, how do you create strong communities around successful mines?
And did you notice a shift in these people from I almost want to say a joy point of view? Did they seem more joyful, did they seem just a bit more driven because their families are close by? And now you're not just doing something because you need to earn an income and send money back home. That's just one part of it. When you go home at night, you're
Yes.
surrounded by your loved ones.
Yes.
So did you notice a shift in these individuals?
There's no doubt. Just family life, performance, work performance, levels of crime, levels of addiction. Direct correlation between being able to be part of a stable family unit when you go home in the evening versus going back to a hostel where there's this crazy, unnatural position that you're putting people into. Effectively, hostels were like boarding school for life, right? And I never went to boarding school, but some people loved it, some people hated it. But if you had to do that for the whole life, I think people would have gone, no, wait, this isn't right.
I want to get into Peco Power.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what made you invest. What was the conversation for Umbono and Dorian to actually invest in Peco Power?
It's interesting how these things come across one's path. And I remember it was 2018, and I got a call from a friend and acquaintance of mine, Professor Willy Cronje, head of electrical engineering at the time at Wits University. And he said, Dorian, come over to the lab. I want to show you something. And I went over to the lab and I saw the earliest prototype of what we now call the power brick. And this power brick, Willy started telling me the story. He said, Dorian, in 2014, he'd been working on it for 4 years. He said, in 2014, I was faced with a challenge as to how do we solve the electrification crisis in Africa. We've all seen that picture. I'll send it to you. Maybe you can put it on the podcast as well. That picture of Africa at night and how dark the continent of Africa is compared to Europe and the US. There are pockets. Johannesburg, there's a bright light. Lagos, there's a bright light. Cape Town, there's a little bit of a light there. But for the rest, by far the largest part of the continent is just covered in darkness. And that speaks of so many things. Economic activity, for one, right? And he just was caught by this challenge. How do we solve the electrification crisis in Africa? So he did what every good academic does. He started going out and saying, well, let me see what's available out there. Because he knew early on, very quickly he realized that it's going to have to be an off-grid solution. It's going to have to be a microgrid or something that's not connected to the national grid, because there are parts of Africa where you can fit the whole of France and Germany and it will not touch. The landmass, the land size, you can fit the whole of France and Germany into parts of Africa and they will not touch a transmission line. Just shows you the tracts of land within Africa that have got no transmission or distribution infrastructure in them. So he realized it's got to be an off-grid solution. And so he started looking at all the off-grid products out there, and he was unimpressed with every single one that he saw, because he was unimpressed with the quality of the product. But more important than even the quality, he was unimpressed with the functionality of these products, because he realized that whilst they could solve a specific purpose, it could do lighting, or maybe the bigger systems could run a TV. He realized very quickly that there was no system that could scale. These systems, you cannot take one system, run lights, plug in a second one, run a TV, plug in a third one and run a fridge. And so as your electricity, as your wealth or your prosperity increases, how do you grow your electrification solution? The way you and I, we don't think about it, right? We're connected to a national grid, and you get a TV, you plug it in and it works. And then you can afford a dishwasher, you plug that in and it works, right? How do you do this in communities where they have no access to electricity? And so he started thinking and scratching his head, and God actually gave him a solution. God gave him a solution which he saw in nature, and I don't know if we've got time to go into it now, but effectively he saw a way that in nature complex tasks are achieved without centralized control. It's called stigmergy. And God gave him a solution based on the stigmergy philosophy in nature, and this is how he built the power brick. And so the power brick can operate as a single standalone system, but it creates an electricity grid. which means that you can start attaching loads to that grid. And then if you run out of capacity on that grid, you just add more power to that grid. So you plug in a second power brick. It's plug and play, automatically grows your grid. And so now you've doubled up the size of your grid, you've doubled up your energy component in your battery, and you can keep adding to this so that your needs, as your needs go from just lighting to entertainment to appliances in your home, you can keep growing as your needs grow without needing to throw out the original infrastructure that you've invested in.
Could you describe more about the power brick in terms of its functionality and what makes it unique?
So the power brick is effectively a small power system, a power station. It has got currently they have lithium-ion batteries inside of them, and but they could pretty much run the IP allows you to put any kind of battery you want inside of it. It can be powered off a solar panel or off the grid currently, but again, you could plug in a little hydro generator in time, and it could run off any renewable or unrenewable source, to be honest. And so it's got multiple inputs, and it's got the ability to seamlessly expand as your needs grow. Now you can expand that obviously within a single dwelling, but ultimately you could connect two dwellings together, and you could then interconnect dwellings, and you would have a microgrid. And so you'd be able to build a grid from the bottom up, with the difference that this grid is self-managing and self-healing, and you will never need an external control just to make sure the grid's balanced, because the grid balances itself individually at each of the nodes.
Yeah, I love that. You talked about it charging through renewable sources.
Yes.
Would there be any challenges or limitations around charging the device?
So one thing Africa has a lot of is beautiful renewable energy, solar being one of them. I don't think there's any other continent in the world that has the solar credits that Africa's got. So that's an automatic, obvious one. Certain parts of Africa have got good hydro resources, and so that's something else. And then, of course, there's wind as well. And so because it's flexible and it can run off a number of different renewable options, we've started with solar because you can use it anywhere in Africa. And effectively you can size the panel for the power brick, and you can then have effectively almost unlimited number of options.
And in terms of the time for charging?
It depends again, so we're getting quite technical now in the sense of, so again, the IP is quite flexible, but there's a balance between how fast you want it to charge and how long you want the battery to last. So one of the dilemmas with the host of products out there is there's no consistent set of guidelines by which people need to quote what it is that their system can do. And so a lot of guys will talk about fast charging, etc. But what they don't tell you, unless you read the fine print, is that if you charge the battery too quickly, you're gonna limit the life of that battery. And so so we've gone with batteries that are going to do a minimum of 2,000 cycles, and then they're not done. Then you'll start seeing a little bit of a drop off in possibly the performance. Maybe it doesn't charge to 100%. Maybe it only goes to 90 or 80%. But it is important that one reads the fine print when it comes to all of these things. And
2,000 cycles refers to?
So 2,000 cycles would refer to a charge up and a full discharge, right? And this is very important. If you are looking for a load shedding device, make sure that the system you are wanting to acquire firstly quotes the number of cycles, and then read the fine print. So a lot of them don't quote the cycles at all. The better ones do quote the cycles, but then some of them are as low as 500. Think about it. If you've got load shedding once a day, 500 cycles is 18 months. You're done. That battery's gone, right? If you've got load shedding once a day on 2,000 cycles, you've got a good 5 to 7 years of life in that. And if we're going to ship these units up into parts of Africa where there's very little infrastructure, you don't have the luxury of being able to replace your battery every 12 to 18 months. You need something that's a lot more robust. And so that's a critical component. And so building these things if our market is Africa, building these things in a way that they're going to be sustainable and long-lasting is critical.
And speaking about this market, how do people afford it?
So we spoke about worldviews, and our different worldviews have different ways of solving problems. So at Peco, we've decided that in order for us to create wealth for as many people as possible, we need to do two things when it comes to the distribution and the marketing of our product. Number one, very few people can afford in Africa. A lot of people are living on less than $2 a day. Very few people can afford $150 once off to buy a product. But if you're earning $2 a day, maybe you could afford between $5 and $10 a month for a system that's going to change your life, that's going to allow your kids to keep studying when it gets dark, that's going to allow you to have a little business where you can charge your neighbors' smartphones, because I can use candles to give me lighting, but candles can't charge my smartphone just yet, right? So that's a little tricky. So you give people the ability, you charge them $5 to $10 for a system that changes their life and gives them an ability to earn an income on something, and now it becomes affordable. Even just in South Africa, I don't know if you know this, Nathan, but a lot of people with the load shedding, they will give their cell phones to somebody that's going into town, and they'll be charged 10 Rand for the benefit of getting a charged cell phone back. What does that mean? That means that for 12 hours you don't have communications, and you're $10 short every time that needs to happen. Let's say that happens 5 times a month. That's 50 Rand. You know what I mean? Now, I could save that 50 Rand and put it into the cost of a system. But B, I could probably charge my neighbors 5 Rand, and then the phone is not gone for 12 hours. It's gone for an hour whilst it's charging in my device. And so you can see the benefit that it can create in a community. And so the first thing we needed to do was say, is there a way that we can pay it off over a period of time? And our system locks every 30 days, just to remind you that, okay, your next payment's due. And on that payment, we SMS you an unlock code, and you can unlock your system, and off it goes again. But the second thing that we've done is we didn't say, well, let's go and find the biggest retail networks in those countries or those communities. We said, let's go into those communities and find people in the community that would like to start a mini Peco franchise. And for a mini Peco franchise, you could serve 200, 250 of your neighbors on a rent-to-own basis. You could make, let's say, 30 Rand per subscription per month. You times that by 200, that's 6,000 Rand a month on a mini Peco franchise business, just on rental subscriptions. You could make more on selling systems. You could make more on add-ons. And so what we've decided to do is rather spread that wealth through the communities. Who's more concerned about the community than the guy that lives there himself, than the woman that lives there herself? And if she then brings the system, her neighbors see, hey, Sarah's got lights. And now she said, they go and say, Sarah, how do we get one? Sarah says, well, let me sign you up. It costs 150 Rand a month. And for every time the neighbor pays, Sarah earns 20 to 30 Rand. Can you see how this creates wealth, and it creates kind of a buzz in the community, and it uplifts the entire community? We've got guys that have got these systems in their little barbershops, where for somewhere between 2 and 10 hours a day, sometimes they have no power, depending on when the load shedding comes back on again, right? And sometimes in these communities, it doesn't come on like it comes on in Stellenbosch and Houghton and some of the kind of the more affluent areas in our country, and this means this guy can keep his business going when he typically would have to sit there and wait for the power to come back on.
Okay, and I want to get into actually how this is possible. So is it just upskilling these individuals in these communities and allowing them to then be entrepreneurs?
Yeah.
How would that look? And if you could give me some tips as to the rollout plan. Like, that would be amazing.
So to be honest, this is not the easy way to do it. The easy way to do it would be to go and sign up a big retailer that already has a reach throughout the country and let them take the profits. That would be the easy way to do it. The hard way to do it is to go into a community, find an anchor partner, local church, NGO, maybe a business person that has got a real community presence and brand, and with the help of that anchor partner, identify between 15 and 25 agents, depending on how big the community is. And then equipping those agents and training them and effectively discipling them in what it's going to take in order for them to build a successful business, and how to manage their cash flow, and how to become skilled at negotiation and closing, what good customer service looks like. Now, that is not the easiest way to do this. But because my worldview is how do we create wealth as broadly as possible, I'm saying it's worth the effort. Because my objective is not just to try and sell as many Peco Power systems as possible, it's to change as many lives in that process. I was leaving the lab at WITS the one afternoon, and a young man stopped me, and I could see he was looking to kind of ask me an impressive question. And his question was this. He said, Mr. Wrigley, can I ask you something? I said, sure. He says, why do you think Peco will be successful when there are so many competitors out there? And that's a good question, right? And I said, I'll tell you why I think Peco will be successful. Because we don't see the competitors as those that are selling similar products. The real enemy out there is not our competitors. The real enemy out there is poverty, which is destroying the lives of people. And there are 600 million people in Africa that have no access to power. To be honest, there aren't enough suppliers. If Peco can challenge others to come into this market and offer a better product at a more competitive price, which means it puts it in the hands of more people, then that's success. Now, I know a lot of, maybe that's not what they teach at the MBA class, but it's what makes me get up in the morning and gives me an excitement to keep doing what I'm doing, despite the fact that I told you I'm feeling challenged right now. But that's the challenge that I'm trying to solve for.
And going into these communities, apart from electrifying them, what else do you think is required to actually get them out of their current situation?
That's such a great question. You know, somebody once asked a community of poor people what they needed, what they lacked. And I remember watching this interview. And in my mind, as soon as they asked the question, I thought, that's obvious. They lack money. And you know what this woman said? She said, I lack everything. I lack a sense of purpose. I lack a sense of belonging. I feel insignificant, that if I were to die tomorrow, no one would care, no one would notice. And oh, by the way, yes, I do lack money. But I realized that it's not money that's going to solve this problem. Poverty, when people live in poverty, they need everything. And it starts with giving them hope and a sense of purpose and a sense of destiny. And what power does is a catalyst in people's lives that hopefully will be able to start a process by which they can move towards achieving and attaining all of that. A kingdom worldview doesn't say, let me give it to you for free, though. A kingdom worldview says, let me give you something to get you going, but let me see how much you want this and how much you're prepared to work for it, and then I will help you. The Word of God tells us if we're faithful with little, He'll make us faithful. He'll entrust us with more and more and more. And that's really the philosophy that I base my life on. It's the philosophy which I kind of try and work together with in partnership with others, but it's the philosophy that I want to employ with people. People want handouts. I'm sorry, Peco is not going to be the right place for you, because I know a handout's not going to help you. But if you're prepared to say, thank you, I'm going to take the little bit you're going to give me and I'm going to work it and, and grow it and then try and trust for more. That's the person I want to work with. And that's why it's so hard, because for people that have had nothing and that have just trying to go from surviving one day to the next, I know that that's a process. People don't automatically feel and think that way. And so that's what makes this so hard, because I don't expect that we're going to have 100% success rate. I don't even think that we're going to have, success rate. We may have to go iterate it a few times with people before we even have success rate with some of them. But I guess that's what we're signing up for at Peco.
And do you think that this is a step that you are taking to actually bridge the wealth distribution gap? You gave me a stat earlier today before we started speaking about the distribution gap.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could kindly walk us through that.
So we looked at a slide, and I think you're probably going to pop it up for the viewers to see it. If you look at South Africa, if you look at the slide, and this slide really shows the wealth distribution across South Africa. Not to be confused with the Gini coefficient that talks about the income distribution. This is actually a lot more prevalent. This is the wealth. This is who owns the assets in South Africa. This is a study that was done in 2020 at Wits University. Blew my mind when I saw it. Over 50% of the people in South Africa have zero net wealth, zero net worth. In fact, it's a little worse than zero. On average, they're in debt to the tune of 16,000 Rand. Now, that's a tragic situation.
50% of the population.
50% of the working-aged population, so the adult population, we're talking about, in 2020, it was about 17.5 million people of a total of 35. So 35 out of 60 being kind of the working population in South Africa, half of them, 17.5 million of them, have zero net wealth. The next 40% have about 15% of the net wealth, and the top 10% have 85% of the country's net wealth. Now, Nathan, the interesting thing is whenever I discuss this slide with people, there are a number of very interesting emotions that I observe. The one I observe is just despair. People go, oh my gosh, where do we even start to solve a problem like that? Interesting, a close second is anger. One being those greedy, filthy guys at the top, right? And another one being, well, I work for what I do. And, don't kind of like criticize me because I worked for mine. So I find anger is quite prevalent in a room, depending on, who's in that room. And then there's fear. People going, well, am I going to lose what's mine because 50% of the population have nothing? Is it going to be taken from me? And if we circle back to the worldview discussion we had earlier, a socialist worldview would say, yeah, we solve that by just taking from the 85 and we just redistribute it. But I don't know. I think a generation later, you might find that distribution is going to be back to similar levels than it was before, because there are certain people that are gifted and skilled. And unless we change the skills of that lower 50% to be able to kind of value it and create and turn that wealth and make more, it's going to flow through their hands quite quickly and end up back in the hands of those that are skilled. And so it's not just a move the wealth from one to the other. And but that particular slide is what motivates us in the morning, because what I'm saying is a kingdom view on this would be, let's not wait for government's policies to change. Let's not wait for socialist or capitalist kind of like principles to catch up. 50% have and 50% don't. How about if everybody on the 50% who has just took responsibility for one person below? What kind of impact? If half of us above took responsibility for one person below, what change would that have? And that, to me, I believe is a kingdom mindset, because what that does is it doesn't say, I'm waiting for the government to make policy for us to change. It's saying, hang on, I have something. What is God telling me to do with this? How can I change someone's life? Not give it all away, but how can I use the bit I've got to make difference in one other person's life? Empower them, upskill them, give them an opportunity that they won't be getting, but that I can help create for them. And not just give and then walk away, but then give and walk alongside. Because that group that needs everything is going to need more than just a handout. They're going to need education. They're going to need mentoring. They're going to need coaching. They're going to need helping them create opportunities. They're going to need, how do I change? How do I equip my kids? How do I get them into the right schools? How do I apply for the right university? They're going to need all of that, and that takes effort. But it starts here by saying we can actually make a difference. And then, you know what? 2024 elections, hopefully some policies come along to help us, but let's not wait for the policies, right? Let's not put our hope and faith in the politicians, man, because we can make a difference ourselves. And that really is what motivates us. If we can, my sense is we can create 1 million wealth-creating opportunities for people by rolling out Peco Power across Africa. It's got to start somewhere, starting in one community with one agent, and then from there it needs to scale. And so those are the partners I'm looking for, Mason. I'm looking for partners that are saying, hey, I get that, and I want to be part of that process, part of that solution. And let's figure out how we can do it together.
We hope we can help in finding those partners.
I would be very grateful.
Dorian, I want to thank you for giving me your time and also just blessing me with your wisdom and all our viewers. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge you for showing up consistently for the past 2 decades, even longer, for not just yourself and your loved ones, but extending that to communities, to African communities, not just in South Africa, but in other African countries. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And I just want to see you and your vision come together so we can actually eradicate or put steps in place to eradicate poverty. So thank you.
Mason, thank you. It was an absolute honor to be here with you, and I appreciate the time.
No
Thanks
problem.
so much.
Thanks, Dorian.